Thank you for dropping by to watch this video. My name is Marc McLaren and I'm a member of the Art of Work team. We were planning on hosting a networking event, and then with COVID-19 that was no longer possible nor sensible to run it. So we moved quickly to a virtual networking event using video conferencing. It was a fantastic conversation. The conversation was hosted by Professor Sidney Dekker from Griffith University and Michael Tooma from Clyde & Co. And what we were looking at was the importance of learning and understanding what drives performance and how you might better measure that. And really, in a sense, COVID-19 had sort of triggered thinking as well in that space. Sydney got us started by thinking about the idea of what do we mean by resilience and the idea of adaptive capacity, and how do you control, how do you build that adaptive capacity. And he drew on a real life story of Canada and the health system and looked at what happened when adaptive capacity was encouraged, when people were encouraged to be part of the solution. And it had a great relevance not only to thinking about learning and performance, but also how we might manage the current crisis of COVID-19, and also how we might accelerate out of that in terms of recovery. Michael then opened up the conversation thinking about then the role rules might play in this space, regulation, legislation, requirements within organisations, the importance of compliance. And while acknowledging that rules play a role, Michael challenged that space as to whether or not it's really rules that deliver success. And he explored the idea of freedom within a framework. You know, what happens when you give people an enabling system to function, particularly around having a clear sense of purpose and goal and inviting people to align themselves around that. We then talked about measurement, and particularly how do we know that we're getting better at something. And Michael then shared something of the Safety Due Diligence Index that we've been working on, and invited people to engage with that tool and provide some, I suppose, input. Kelvin Genn, one of the directors of Art of Work, then talked a bit about the role of learning teams and how they can play a part in actually helping us to deliver successful work. So I hope you enjoy it. There's also a lot of discussion that takes place. There were some great questions asked. It was a lot of fun. So settle back, go grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee, depending on the day and where you are. Maybe wine, beer, some crackers and cheese, and enjoy. And please let us know, reach back to us at Art of Work. We'd love to get your feedback. We'd love to further this conversation. Thank you. Warm welcome. Kelvin will in a moment get the formal sort of networking event underway, but we really do appreciate that you've taken the time and effort to join us. I imagine your world is probably like ours, being turned upside down. So we appreciate that you've made this a priority to be part of this with colleagues, to engage in a conversation, to think about operational resilience, to think about different ways of entertaining measurement, and particularly about how we might go about learning. And so given that we've got quite a few people here and it's almost 5 past, let's make a start. Can I hand over to you, please, Kelvin, to kick off the networking event this afternoon, please?
Thanks, Mark. And thanks to everyone who's been able to join us this afternoon. And it's a bit of a moving feast. We had planned this a little while ago, probably in December, after our first meeting that we'd held in Michael's offices in Sydney. And the plan was to move forward and further the conversation in Melbourne. We've obviously had to adapt, which we're doing, and adapting in the world that seems to be changing on a daily basis. So in the conversation today, and we really want it to be a conversation. That conversation is going to be led by Michael Tooma and Sydney Decker. And we're going to position it around, I suppose, a couple of ideas, but those ideas will be well immersed in the experiences that we're living in at the moment. It's a very difficult time for all of our businesses and all of our associated clients and the people that are working for us. At a time that I think we as a profession have a lot to contribute and a lot to do in finding a way forward and finding a way to successfully move through this and making sure that we bring our people through and we do the best that we can for them and the best that we can for our organisation. So whilst we're sort of having a discussion about continuing in a condition of chaos, really it's about joining together some of the intellect and the ideas and the minds that we have together and charting a way through this in the best way that we can. So we'll do that today, and I'll probably hand over the discussion firstly to Sydney, and Sydney, I'll let you take the introduction and take the discussion forward. So, and then following that, we'll hand over the microphone to Michael.
Yeah, let me just close the window here because it's blowing like 40 kilometers an hour in Brisbane. Colleagues, thank you. Thank you for joining despite the challenges that we all face at the moment. And happy to assume that you're all healthy, that you can at least are healthy enough to participate, including Kelvin. So the few remarks that I wanted to make today, which are quite different from the meeting that we had in December, because the world in which we currently live is very different. The prelude that I would want to give is for Michael and then Kelvin to talk more about learning teams, about how we can not only deal with the present, but accelerate out of the near future once conditions start changing again, and how these ideas can help you be ahead of the pack. So I envision talking for about 10 minutes. I have no slides. Both Michael and I are post PowerPoint, I think, if Michael ever was PowerPoint to begin with.
Generally allergic to PowerPoint.
Well, I'm allergic to Bill Gates to begin with, but now what we have found, and you wouldn't be joining this conversation if you hadn't found that out yourself either, is that in order to be resilient, control of critical risks is not enough. Preventing accidents, controlling accidents is not enough. Controlling human error is not enough. What the literature, of course, has been discovering since certainly 2006, when the first resilience workshop was held in Södertörp in Sweden with, I was there, Eric Holnagel, of course, Dave Woods, Nancy Levison, lots of luminaries were there to set up essentially this new field. That the control that we seek is control of adaptive capacity. And it's sort of a contradiction in terms, because adaptive capacity itself suggests that you're able to respond dynamically to complex and emerging situations that are very difficult to predict, the outlines of which are very difficult to sketch, and a future in which we can only predict probabilities, not certainties. And so how can you control anything? Well, given the responsibilities and accountabilities that you have, as well as the demands being placed on you right now, what I want to guide you through really quickly is what the literature suggests and practical experience backs up as your capacity to, in fact, control adaptive capacity in your people. Because as managers, as accountable people, as leaders, you somehow want to seek and demonstrate that control over the adaptive capacity in your organization, which is, again, the lovely paradox that we also try to catch when we say freedom in a frame. It's both freedom and a frame, right? So there's limits, borders, but there's freedom. And the same is true for control. How can you control adaptive capacity? You can control the conditions that give rise to adaptive capacity. And learning teams are, of course, a very important component in doing that. Let me take you back to a study that most of you will have heard me talk about, but it's of course from the Canadian Hospital, in which we very much around the same time that Eric was writing about safety too, discovered that what made things go well in this hospital, and lots of things went wrong, but what made things go well in this hospital was not the absence of control of critical risk. It wasn't the absence of human errors. It wasn't the absence of violations. It was the presence of positive capacities, which we then qualitatively started digging out of that data. And you might recall among that was the capacity to bring diversity to a team. Now, the more diverse the team, the more the requisite variety, right? The cybernetic idea from the 1950s and 1960s even. If you can never control a system if your own complexity is not anywhere near matching the complexity of the system, right? So requisite variety essentially is a cybernetic way of saying you need to have a diverse array of responses at your disposal. Well, the way to do that is to have diverse teams. This is where Australia struggles, as we know, right? When most CEOs are called Mark, Peter, and John, and in fact, those three names occur more often than they're in fact, our entire country has female CEOs. Those are troubling data about the lack of diversity, but diversity comes in many ways, of course. Gender, background, cultural, economic background, but the literature seems to support most strongly that you want professional diversity, right? Different professions, different angles on the complex problem. So diversity of other kinds is good. Professional diversity is almost required, all right? So that was obvious in this hospital. The more diverse the team, the more likely it was that they didn't screw something up. The other capacity, and of course, and again, I'm talking about your control of that adaptive capacity. Through learning teams, another means that I think this discussion and the ideas that we come with can help you with, can assist you in creating that control over adaptive capacity. Okay, so the second one that we found was if you're a team that keeps a discussion about risk alive, despite the fact that things may look good, it means that you are the high reliability crowd. The Northern Californians like to call this, preoccupation with failure. I find that a very oppressive and depressing way of putting it, but it's sort of psychologically talking about the same thing. You're preoccupied with failure. You brief things even though things look really good, but brief things for if they don't. I think we probably are seeing a situation that's rapidly emerging in such a sense that we currently wonder whether we were enough preoccupied with failure. And things are going to be failing in the next few days that we probably were not ready for. So that seems to confirm that idea. Teams that are not taking past success as a guarantee of future success are the ones that create better outcomes in that study, which makes sense, right? In a complex, dynamic world, which we are very much, we've always been in it, but right now it's almost undeniable that we're in a complex and highly dynamic world. Taking past success as a guarantee of success tomorrow is useless. All right, past success is no guarantee for success tomorrow. You need to look at other capacities present in your system, your people, your processes, to try to guarantee a probability of success, not a certainty, but a probability of success tomorrow. The fourth one that we of course found was, and this is again consistent with what we've been finding since the 1970s, deference to expertise. In those places where decision-making gravitates toward expertise rather than hierarchy, you most often get better decisions and better outcomes. Hierarchy and expertise very often diverges. In some organizations, they partially overlap, right? But in many, they don't. And the people who are in charge are not the people who know. And so that, they know certain things, but not the things that become operationally risky or brittle or can run into serious trouble. So deference to expertise is a recurring finding. And I'm talking 40, 50 years of research in disasters and resilience and things going wrong and staying right that keep confirming this. So That again is a control of an adaptive capacity that is within your hands, right? What experts are around the table? How diverse is their background, right? And so their professional background. These things give you control over adaptive capacity. Finally, some others, of course, people who don't wait for audits and inspections to improve or anticipate things and start changing things are often those who succeed in a changing world, right? If you wait for regulators or others to come in and say that something is amiss, the things they're going to tell you are not going to be helpful anyway, as we know, but then you're behind the curve, right? So, an interesting one that was not in the data set because, well, it may have been, but we weren't looking for it, but has become very obvious in today's world, is that a adaptive capacity that we may all be experiencing, in part involuntarily, is removal of non-essential clutter. Encrustations, bureaucratic, personnel, other encrustations around our core operational activities and responsibilities that have grown over time in a world that was luxuriating in its own fat. Now that we're facing a situation in which survival mode seems to be the word of the day, that luxuriousness or luxury is no longer affordable, obviously, and so it gets cut. I would want to make, but this is a hypothesis. I think we're all part of a huge experiment here, right? But those who meaningfully, fairly, and perhaps in a sense ruthlessly deal with these encrustations and these administrative sources of clutter that now tend to be shoved aside or given more leniency around, this is even happening at my university, are probably those who are able to accelerate out of this chaos quicker than others, because they have ditched the baggage. That's a hypothesis, and one that I'm very willing to discuss and that we could take up in our discussion about learning teams. So what I've just done is given you an overview of that, that research that suggests what capacities are available for you to control in order to increase the adaptive capabilities of your entire system. A few concluding remarks about what that means for resilience versus some other words that have been used in this context. If you look at early resilience research, it very clearly is still captured by this engineering metaphor of a complex system of your organization. It sees resilience as the third add-on of a system that is reliable, robust, and then resilient. And what this research typically says is that a reliable system or reliable component doesn't fail. That is, the mean time between failures is very long, right? Now, that's really nice, but the problem is that doesn't predict much in a rapidly changing world. And just having a system of a lot of reliable components that don't get coronavirus, for example, is really nice, but it doesn't mean much if the world around you is spinning out of control, right? And so reliability is not enough. So then people start talking about robustness. Okay, well, what is robustness? Typically, the engineering metaphor that gets used there is the idea of redundancy, right? If one part can fail, one person can get corona, then at least have another one in his or her place to cover for those tasks. Now, redundancy is really nice, but even that, not only does it create new problems in terms of particularly social redundancy, we make assumptions that we got two parts that are able to do the same function, that there 1 + 1 is actually 2. Well, Kelvin is in fact sitting on research back from his New South Wales health days that suggests the opposite, that the fallacy of social redundancy makes a system more brittle and more likely to fail because we make all kinds of assumptions about the availability of the other, the knowledge of the other, the insight and expertise of the other that may not be true. So then people start talking about resilience. Well, the idea there is, what if we push the system all the way to the edge of its operating envelope? The sense that we're having where we are now with many of our organizations. We're teetering on the brink. Will we survive? Will we not survive? How much government handouts do we need in order to carry us over for the next few months? Will it be a few months? Perhaps it's going to be 5 months, 6, or more. And so if you push a system all the way to the edge of its safe operating envelope, what will happen? Is it going to crumble and disintegrate and fall and fail? Or is it going to bounce back anywhere near gracefully? That was the original sense of resilience. So essentially, resilience then gets measured as a rebound from trauma, if you will. It gets defined as the time to return to equilibrium. Right? Does it make sense? Which is an important concept in complexity theory, obviously, right? But so the time to return to equilibrium. Resilience was defined as that. However, more recent research suggests that resilience is much more than that. And of course, Eric has written a lot about that, right? Learning, responding, where you could even ask interesting questions about, are we over-responding, under-responding? We're probably doing both at the same time for various aspects of the dynamic situation that we're in. Over-responding in some and creating problems as a result of that, or creating knock-on effects for other parties and stakeholders, right? Let's close the schools, yes, but what about the nurses and docs who then have kids that are at home? And so, you know the deal. So the ideas of resilience have grown significantly since that original idea of bounce back from trauma and measured as a return time to equilibrium. And I didn't want to focus on it too much at this point because I really wanted to, well, nail one point that I have been making, and I've been over my time that I promised already, back to the idea of control of adaptive capacity. What resilience gets seen as now is measured as your capacity to handle more unknown disruptions, right? And the only way to beef up that capacity is to go back to the sort of subcapacities that I talked about initially, in your teams, in your people, in your processes. The discussion this afternoon, hopefully, will reveal some ways in which you can go on these journeys of discovery to control the adaptive capacity in your own organization. Marc, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid, and a great frame up in terms of this notion of adaptive capacity and resilience. And what I thought I might do is, I'm sure I'm madly taking notes and thinking of questions. And the idea is that what we've invited is for Sid and for Michael to seed the conversation. And then I have the job, we've now got, I think, 22 people online. So if we exclude 4, that's being Sid, Michael, Kelvin and myself, you know, my maths serves me that there's 18 people that have a view. And Kelvin and I, when we framed up this networking event, we said, even though it's virtual, we want to facilitate a conversation. So the conversation in a moment might go like this. I have an interesting observation. You've been speaking about this, Sid or Michael. Let me tell you about what I've observed in my organisation, what I'm learning. That would be really useful, not only for Sid and Michael, but also for the rest of those who are in this networking event this afternoon. We also want to understand that robust conversation. If you've been around Sid and Michael long enough, you know they're not shy wallflowers. So you might go, that's a berserk. I'm now channeling Sydney. That's berserk. How could you think that? You know, and we'd actually welcome that conversation. Or the third avenue of conversation, you might say, I'd like to take this a little bit deeper. You said this, I would like to explore that deeper. So first thing is, it might be an observation about what you're learning in your organisation. Secondly, we're very open to you having an alternate view, because if we're going to talk about resilience, Sid, diversity in this team, if we allow the diversity to speak, we'll actually be better at having adaptive capacity. And then the third is, I found that a very interesting thought, and it might be something that someone like Amy has shared, or Kelly. You could then build on that point. So we're very happy for that sort of way, and that'll be my job in a moment. But I'm very appreciative, Michael, for you also taking the time to join the networking event. So I'm going to hand over to you. You have the microphone. You have, let's say, 10, 15 minutes to frame up your thinking, and then we'll open the conversation. And the first person I'm going to come to, just so we know, in opening the conversation, it would be remiss, would be you, Kelvin. So I'll come back to you first and get you to make some comments and some observations, and then I'm going to hand it to the floor. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Mark. If I reflect on the events of the last few weeks, I think it serves as a very useful analogy to the debate that we, for a long time, Sydney, Kelvin, Mark, others on this call, on this VC networking event, have been having. Do you actually need rules? Or in the absence of rules, can you have a well-functioning system? And the reason I say that is because as we and thank you for the organisers for arranging the chaos, which was the last 24 hours of our political system, as a prompt and a platform for this discussion. As the issue of the pandemic has emerged, a number of very sensible organisations have voluntarily, without prompt, without the threat of laws, liability, prosecution, regulators, sensibly moved to a remote work arrangement. They did it both in terms of the health and safety of their workers, and more importantly, I suspect, the welfare of the general public in trying to quell this pandemic. This happened in Australia without much prompting and well ahead of what we've seen in terms of the last 24 hours of foreshadowed shutdowns, which ultimately turned out to be very limited shutdowns. Most of corporate Australia moved quickly and moved their people into remote working arrangements. This is the best illustration that I can think of how ultimately, if you are goal motivated and if you are motivated to meet an objective, you actually, and you have a collection of people who have an alignment of those objectives, you don't actually need a lot of intervention or a lot of rules. And we keep on forgetting this lesson. We learn this lesson and we keep on forgetting it. What we point to is the exceptions to the rules, the Bondi example, the people who are flaunting the rules. But we miss the fact that for the most part, a number of organisations, against their self-interest, against their monetary interests, have moved without regulation. By contrast, you hear a lot of people talking about, well, you know, I won't take steps until the government tells me to, or I will follow directions, and that's all that I will do in terms of engaging with the question. The reason I use that as an introduction to my comments is because my area of expertise is more often than not used as the excuse why we have the large volume of clutter in organizations. We need those rules because there'll be some idiot who won't follow the rules. So we will force the 99% to suffer having to sign on to a bunch of rules that will diminish the credibility of the system, just in case in a one-off situation, someone can't understand the purposive approach or the objective that we're trying to achieve. And we will have a backup, a defense that we can wave around that, all these people signed on to these senseless pieces of paper. What we miss in the process is what we create. We create a bureaucracy. We create a disconnect between people, work, and the overall objective. We create a tension between people believing that leadership is concerned about our safety, and instead believing that what the leadership is concerned with is avoiding liability. And we get that tension, we accentuate it by picking off examples, and this is the bias in our approach, that then prove the point that we've been trying to make. In other words, we single out instances of failure, and we point to them as justification for the 99.9% of the existence of the system in circumstances where the 99.9% is actually not required or warranted or in many respects helpful. So for me, it often frustrates me that the law, the regulator, and fear of the law and regulators gets used as an excuse, a justification for why we have a bureaucratic system. And so I talk about it as planning for failure is the current approach. And what we should be doing is planning for success and not failure. What I mean by that is we seem to develop systems for the day in which the system breaks down, and you need my services or the services of my colleagues. Frankly, you'd be much better off, and this will come as a shock to all of the participants. I'm good value, but I'm not cheap. You'll be much better off planning for a system that works and therefore minimizing the risk of failure and the likelihood of failure, and therefore not needing to defend yourself in circumstances where the system fails. And so for me, using the law as a reason for the clutter or an excuse for the clutter probably says more about the organization and its culture than it actually says about the state of the law and the state of regulators. We need to go back to basics as to why we have concepts like the duty of care, why we have the approach that we have in the law in relation to performance-based objectives of saying, you go out and work out how best it is to protect the health and safety of your people, and why for a long time we've left it to businesses to determine what the right approach is in relation to those matters. It is not because it's all about the law. It's actually because there should be at least a perfect alignment between the corporate objective, the desire to protect people, the people's desire to be protected, and the objective of society in terms of having a duty of care and an outcome where people go home safe and actually more than just mentally well, but also mentally fulfilled and engaged, and feel like they've made a contribution to society and the community. And we missed that latter point, and as people know, that's a particular issue of interest for me. So that's the first point I want to make, that don't use the law as an excuse. And we've seen in the last couple of weeks the best and worst of people and justifications for why we have rules, and that's how the media likes to express it. But no one's actually talking about how despite the worst of days that this country has seen in some time, a lot of people are actually pitching in at organizational level to make a contribution in relation to doing the right thing rather than waiting to be told what that thing is. The second point that I want to make to frame this conversation is that there really needs to be a realignment of the reporting, the outcome-based accountability, and the system itself. What I mean by that is that, and the profession is, the safety profession is certainly contributed to this problem that we find ourselves in. We have created a number of metrics that we tout around as being indicators of the safety outcome. And we all know, in participating in this networking event, that they are highly ineffective in indicating anything, let alone indicating the state of safety in the organisation. And then by proxy, these metrics are used as a reassurance in relation to legal exposure, and in that respect, they are equally as ineffective, in fact, quite dangerously ineffective in relation to measuring the extent of legal exposure. We need to go back to basics. We need to go back to a way in which we can correlate the state of safety with the way in which we measure safety, if we are to have any indication from a legal liability perspective of how well we are stewarding the organisation from a safety perspective. And consistent with that, we need to get over ourselves and start listening to people. Where we lose our way in organisations is that our version of deference to expertise that Sydney talks about has become to deference to anyone other than the real people who have that expertise, and that is the workers themselves, who are actually actively engaged in the work, who are facing the challenges on a day-to-day basis, who are the ones that know whether they have the resources, means of performing the work, skills, whether the systems are useful or not. And actually, when you start talking to them, can give you a lot of clues as to how to improve the system, both from an operational perspective, but crucially from a safety perspective. And guess what? It has nothing to do with a checklist. It absolutely has nothing to do with an audit. It has nothing to do with all the gimmicks that we safety professionals talk about. It's about practical means in which you can actually improve the way in which work is done, that lives higher up the hierarchy of controls in terms of elimination, substitution, and engineering controls. They won't be telling you how to get them a better PPE, I assure you that. They certainly won't be telling you how to make an additional administrative control, another form for them to fill out. They're sick and tired of the forms they're filling out already. They're going to talk to you about how to fix the process so that people then get hurt. And so we need to go back to basics and go back to engaging with workers, having deference to their expertise, preferring their expertise over ours, and seeing ourselves as champions of that conversation, facilitating that conversation, rather than being substitutes for that expertise. I'll hand it back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Michael. And again, you know, setting up a really interesting conversation around the role rules play, and how do we, in a sense, get a meaningful metric about performance, and how do we shift to this idea of focusing on measuring success, and how do we actually get out of our own way? Because often we actually are the ones who unintentionally, with goodwill and intent, inadvertently create some of the dilemmas. And what I thought was really interesting, Michael, we actually, in the end, push, because of that lack of difference to expertise, we push people down the hierarchy of control. Yeah. We only let them talk about things which are administrative. Yep. And therefore we actually drive greater inefficiency. And back to Sid's point, we have then less capacity to have this ability to adapt. So I thought I might hand over to you, Kelvin, and get you to maybe reflect on some of your thoughts. And then what we'll do, Kelvin, is open the floor up then for conversation.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Sydney and Michael. I thought I'd probably just like to give you a bit of lived experience over the last couple of weeks in sharing and bringing together what Sydney and Michael have thought about. For the last 2 weeks, I've been in the UK working on learning teams with London Luton Airport in a ever evolving situation there with coronavirus, and that was it's interesting to watch how that was developing, particularly in the aviation space. And basically, I returned from London just about a week ago. And similarly, after returning from London a week ago, I've had the lived experience of also trying to live through the coronavirus experience. And from a personal context, I've been in a situation where I come back into the country, been through a process where I was potentially a coronavirus case, and been through that testing process, and just come through the process where I didn't have the condition, but was having the experience of seeing what the process was like from being potentially exposed in that context. And it makes you reflect on a whole range of things. And what I think is, when we're looking in the workplace at the moment, what's happening, there's a lot going on in the workplace where decisions are being made, adjustments are being made, a lot of chaos being placed, and we're doing the best that we can, but to some degree, there's a lot of decisions being made without getting our people to participate in the decision-making process. And I think that's where the opportunity lies. If you tap into what both Michael has been talking about and what Sydney has been talking about from an adaptive capacity point of view, the whole secret to this is about adapting in real time and adapting to changing the way the work is being done at every level that we can think about. And to do that, the best source of that decision making is going back to the people who do the work, and by engaging them in the process of understanding what are the conditions, what are the problems, how do you solve it, and doing that in dynamic real time. It has a multifaceted benefit. Firstly, you're going to get better decisions that if they evolve from the ground up and harness the expertise within the organisation. And we can do this within the remote working environment that we have. But simply by partnering people in those conversations, it's firstly going to make people feel better that they've got contribution and control over what's happening to them, and they're partnered in the decision making. And I think it's really important as we work through this process of engaging people as a solution to harness that the power of partnering them is actually part of the solution. It's not just about solving the problem and making pronouncements and determinations. It's about actually engaging people in that decision making, which is really important in an ever-evolving situation where we've got different types of workers in our workforce now. We've got if you like, the corporate workers who can go and work from home, but then we've got the other workers who are required to operate Woolworths, and they're required to go to the factories, and they're required to do the deliveries and those sorts of things, who don't have that option. And equally, we need to partner them in the decision making and the risk decisions that are being made, so that we can actually get the right determinations for what works for them, what works for the organisations, what works for the country as a whole. So in this whole concept around adaptive capacity, if you like, working to a mode, as Michael talking with, let's get rid of the processes and the rules and think about how do we create successful work. I think this is the time when these concepts that we've been talking about and building and putting in place actually come into their own. It's a time where we leverage the best of what people contribute, partner in that decision-making process, and actually work towards a continuously evolving decision-making process that adapts to the scenarios as they unfold. And it's really a dynamic space. So that's really my observation at the moment, Mark, is I think this is an opportunity for us to think about how we engage in this in a process where we actually bring these adaptive capacities to life, and how we actually engage people in that process.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelvin. And I was just reflecting on a conversation. I won't name the organisation, but it's very large. And the person was sharing with me this morning what they had learned about how to successfully adapt, the adaptive capacity of partnering around recruitment. They said it normally takes, in their organisation, and it wasn't coming from a position of being critical, it was an observation. They said it normally takes our mechanism, our machinery, our rules, our bureaucracy, our system, somewhere around 3 weeks to bring a person into the organisation. We've allowed our people to speak, we've talked to the new people, and we've managed to find a successful way to do that now in 1 hour. So a person can arrive at 11 o'clock and they can be ready to start at 12 o'clock, which I think is a fascinating observation of this idea of successful adaptation. And it's interesting because what we're trying to engage in the conversation this afternoon, and I imagine this would appeal to you, Sid, is we're trying to adopt a notion of dualism, because so often we get into these sort of situations, we become very binary. It must be this or it must be that. And so part of this adaptive notion is being able to hold things creatively in tension. So what I'm going to do to help with this conversation, We've done a wonderful job, team. We have 90 minutes and 45 minutes. We've framed the conversation. So thank you very much to you, Sid, and Michael, and Kelvin. I want to now open the floor. Can I explain how I'm going to do that? So it's an attempt not to apply too many rules. But if I could just ask you, if you'd like to make a comment, I can see on my screen all the participants. And all I need you to do is just to unmute yourself. And then I'll see that you're ready to ask a question, make an observation. Remember I said you could share what you've been learning in your team around these ideas. It could be you've heard something and you go, my goodness, this needs to be challenged. Or you have got something that you'd like to build. Now, it's always really interesting, you know, who goes first. But let me tell you, if you don't go first, Sid and Michael have another great 45 minutes of material. But this wasn't the purpose of this type of conversation. It was, this is a virtual network. I want you to imagine at this point, you have a nice glass of maybe red, a bold Shiraz, or a nice light, crisp Pinot Gris. You've got some, maybe some, cheese on a cracker, and we're sort of standing around now talking. This is the new world that we've adapted to. So I'd like you to put yourself in that frame, rather than this being a formal sort of video conference. You actually are amongst friends and colleagues here. And one of the good things I can say with 100% confidence, we're all in the same boat. And so we really want to see that how we can put this principle into place, that we could learn and engage we collectively as the solution. So that's enough preamble to buy you time to get off mute, because you want me to go on mute in a moment. Bottom left-hand corner, unmute yourself, and once I see that, and I can see Danny, yes.
I'm just saying Danny's been off mute, so.
Yes, great. I've just slid down. Danny, can I please hand the floor to you? Welcome, Danny. We're interested in your observations.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, gents. Danny Harnedy from Horizon, a rail freight operator nationally, but primarily in Queensland. What's interesting, and I think the COVID example that everyone's used as a means of framing this discussion actually does allow me in my organization to really push home a question that I've had formed for a while, but nobody's taken me overly serious on. And that's the issue of whether or not, when it comes to safety, our primary focus should be to know how we demonstrate it versus to know how we measure it. And if I look at what I can see as an awful lot of adaptive behavior going on inside our own organization in response to COVID, including, as Michael described, taking steps long before anybody told you had to, making preemptive risk assessments, they were demonstrable safety. I've got no way of measuring that for any report. So I actually think that, lemonade and lemons are closely related. I believe that COVID gives us a great opportunity to demonstrate to people that safety's primary assessment focus should be demonstration. It's a value. It isn't a physical output that you can repeat over and over again. It's felt in a moment, then you take your eye off it. It isn't there. So it's demonstrating consistently through what happens in the organization, which I think then allows me to take, and again, I took the reference to adaptive capacity. When you have a goal motivated organization, but we always think of goal motivation as being, let me measure where I am relative to that goal, and aligned objectives to get to that goal. As long as we can talk to, through storytelling, narrative, and the occasional lead indicator, and I think the due diligence index is great for taking us in that space, I can move the conversation to being one of about demonstration, not measurement. And that for me is probably a major insight from the last couple of weeks, plus also the session I attended recently in Brisbane around safety 2 and how you bring it into practice. So I'll pause there with that observation and let others speak.
Excellent, thanks, Danny. So would someone else like to, in the networking event, either build on that or take us in a different direction? And then I'm going to come back to you, Michael and Sid. You might want to sort of reflect on this notion of demonstrate and measurement. So before I do that, does anyone else like to make a comment? I can see Ellen. Ellen, please jump in.
Hi. I'm Ellen Downs. I work with LGM Group. I really like your comments there, Danny, around measuring versus ethical reasoning for caring for people and getting the right outcomes. I guess I'm very mindful that what we don't measure doesn't get done in organisations and doesn't quite get the real engagement and the real activity that we really need, that real action orientation. I'm very interested to hear some of those measures and metrics, because I have a very personal passion for metrics and data and how we actually use those to get the right outcomes. So leading indicators that actually have a genuine link to outcomes, as opposed to how many we're doing of whatever the activity is. So I'm very keen to hear from Marc or Sid or others in your organisation where you've seen some of those genuine leading indicators that have a relationship to outcomes.
What I might do then, it's a great build on what Danny's talking about. And thanks, Ellen. Can I maybe come to you, Michael, first to reflect on that, and then either Sid or Kelvin, would you like to jump in?
I really liked Danny's framing of the conversation, but there is a practical challenge that we face. The challenge is that boards speak in numbers. If you want the conversation to occur at a board level, you ultimately are stuck with presenting it in the language of boards. Otherwise, it risks being a tick and flick exercise that people pay lip service to and then move on to more meaningful, quote unquote, things. I feel that the right answer is both a quantitative and a qualitative measure, as in you probably need to have a quality sense, an explanation of what is going on, which is what Danny's referring to, demonstrating that things are moving in the right direction or things are going well, because I can point to those things, but I can't quite put my finger on measuring it. But you also need metrics, not because they are perfect, not because they will give you a complete answer, but because they are the language of boards. One of the reasons why, and I'm gonna, I think you introduced me well, Marc, when you said I'm not, I don't shy from controversy. One of the reasons why safety shares don't work, or putting safety first on the agenda doesn't work, is because once you entertain the separation between the doing of work and something that is symbolic, it gets reduced to a mere gimmick. People comply with the exercise, but they lose the purpose behind it. And so a lot of people put safety first on the agenda, only to go on and move on to all the items of the agenda that completely undermine safety by making harsh operational decisions that are rubbish for safety, but because they ticked off a safety share at the beginning of that, they feel good about the decision making that they've done. It's like blessing it with holy water. You somehow wipe away all of the sins you're about to commit proactively by having something done in that way. Now, I know that's not what Danny meant. I understand that. That's why I think it's actually worthwhile and something worth exploring. But ultimately, we need to engage with the challenge that boards present us, which is that they only understand one language, and that language is metrics. I'm happy to come back to some of the things that Sydney, Kelvin, and I think would work in terms of lead indicators, but I might yield the floor to others to contribute to the debate at this point.
Excellent, thanks, Michael. So Sid and Kelvin, whoever would like to go first, because I think Ellen's challenge is a really useful one, is what's the tangible metric? And if we build off what Michael is saying, well, yes, it needs to be qualitative, it needs to be demonstrated, it needs to be something which can be experienced, but also it needs a language of the board, which at this point is a metric. Kelvin or Sydney, which of you would like to make a comment on that, please? I think Kelvin, you're reaching. Yep, Kelvin.
Thanks, Mark. And the tangible metrics, I think, are going to differ from organisation to organisation. I think where we've really thought about and been developing our ideas and practice over the last 12 months is framed around the elements of the due diligence, 6 elements of due diligence, which Michael was touching upon. And as we've come to think about that, it really from our approach to this is thinking about this in terms of engagement. That process of engagement is thinking about how different parts of the organisation engage into their contribution to the working and practical outcomes that are happening within an organisation. So, in a context, we talk about being focused on critical risk, for example. That's if we're going to have metrics around this space, it's about the engagement piece, about how people are actually engaged on the front line to contributing and adapting to those critical risks, the controls that are in space, the adaptive space that sits around them. And there are, very simple ways that this can be done. What we've got to, avoid is particularly getting attracted into the measures that are intended to measure, positive outcomes, but become the counting of something for its own sake. So the counting of an activity is not going to be very useful. It's got to be around the quality of the process that's occurring and the level of contribution and the quality of that contribution that's occurring. So again, that will depend on the type of work that's happening in different organisations. And in that engagement piece, we're talking about at every dimension, not just at the point where the work has been done, but in terms of every level within the organisation. It depends on how the procurement team are actually engaged in the contribution to understanding how their decisions impact and affect the work that's been done, and meeting the needs of the people that do that work, and thinking about trying to understand how we actually design measures that fit that particular context for different organisations. It's about the leadership team in terms of how they engage and support people for successful and safe work, and how they contribute to the resources that are provided, and to make sure that that actually meets with the needs of the organisation. Just to share a recent example, we were doing some work with an agricultural business in New Zealand, and one of the things, we were looking, we'd actually gone and looked at the issue of milking cows on one of their operations. And when we went and had a look at that, part of the feedback that came from the people involved right at the work was the impact that training had on actually making it more difficult to do their job, where the training had not been designed to match their needs and was taking time out of their ability to do the work, which had significant flow-on effects because of the limited labour resource that they had. And so when we think about these measurements of engagement, from a corporate context, you able to go back and have a look at, if we're going to put resources into training, how well does that actually meet the needs of the work that's been done, and trying to get metrics that actually provide feedback in terms of how well that it works as being part of a broader set of feedback. I'll probably just pause there. I think, Michael, you've got some observations.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Kelvin. What Kelvin was alluding to in relation to the due diligence index is when we, the three of us and others, came together and tried to look at this question, we tried to look at it from first principles. If you're going to put a matrix to a board, if you're going to put a measure, an index to a board, you have to get into the psyche of what does a board want. Why do they want reporting on safety? Part of the reason boards say is because it's a value. Of course, if you've been around global organisations, you know that is a value that depends on what jurisdiction you're in terms of how far your commitment is to that value. Ultimately, it's more than that. It is in part about legal compliance and managing their actual personal liability in relation to those issues. So what they're seeking is an assurance in relation to compliance with their obligations. And that gave us a clue. The second thing that I think is in operation is they want to be able to compare their performance from organisation to organisation. They want whatever it is that they are being presented with to be benchmarkable by industry and benchmarkable by peer group. And crucially, for board members who are non-executive directors, for that to be something that can be benchmarked between various organisations whose boards they sit on. And so ultimately, the most obvious framework to adopt for that purpose and the rules to apply to such a measure would be to look at what the legal obligations are for directors of boards globally, and to set up a set of rules or framework around what those things might look like. Now, due diligence in one description or another, whether as an actual positive obligation as exists in Australia and New Zealand, or as a defence to a duty as exists in Canada, probably other jurisdictions, depending on your terminology of what due diligence means, either meets or exceeds the standards of the personal liability, personal duty of directors of boards worldwide. Which means that is a useful starting point for that legal compliance piece. And it turns out that due diligence has 6 components. Firstly, to acquire knowledge in relation to work health and safety matters, which we term to know. The second is to get an understanding of the nature of the operations and the risks associated with those operations, which we term understand. To have adequate processes for meeting those obligations and resources for meeting those obligations, which we call resource. To have systems for monitoring the performance of the organisation from a health and safety perspective and responding appropriately to risks and incidents, which we talk about as monitoring. To meet minimum legal compliance requirements, which we talk about as complying or comply. And the last one is to verify the effectiveness of those systems and processes, which we talk about as verifying. So if you take those 6 components, and they are to know, to understand, to resource, to monitor, to comply, and to verify, and you build measures that can confidently, proactively give you assurance in relation to each of those elements, then you've gone a long way to meeting one of the crucial objectives that a board has. The second aspect, that second set of the rules that we talked about, is that the definition in relation to how you collect that data has to be consistent across organisations. Otherwise, you're comparing apples with oranges. Now, we haven't, for the purpose of this audience, got into the debate of why the existing TRIFA and other lag indicator measures don't meet that test, but they are perceived to meet that test. Again, if you come back to the debate we're having before, it's a number. And because it's a number, it's attractive. And people think that they know what the number means, even though it actually doesn't mean anything for the most part, because they're not comparable from organisation to organisation, because the definition is different. They're not reliable because the data that goes into it is actually flawed, and it tells you nothing about the state of safety in the organisation. So actually 3 fails, but it's a number, so it's pretty. But we need to have it comparable from organisation to organisation, so at least it meets the fundamental test. If we are going to put something forward that is valid, that is useful, that can credibly and intellectually replace the existing metric, which is so well entrenched. Part of the reason why we've gone to this community and to other communities in the way that we have is that there needs to be a group approach to this. There needs to be an adoption of a consistent set of rules and a consistent approach to the definitions and a consistent approach to what is measured in order for what stands up to be meaningful. Part of the reason why the current lead indicators don't work is because my lead indicator cannot be compared to yours. And by the way, we have a different suite of lead indicators, and it generally, no matter how much we can debate about how effective it is, I can talk about how my state of safety compares to another organisation's state of safety without descending into a discussion about TRIFR and LTIFRs, etc., which this group at least understands is actually a nonsense conversation, because it tells you nothing about the state of the respective safety of both organisations. It tells you that we both are very good at measuring certain things in a particular way and usually manipulating that data to reflect what we want that data to mean. So they're the set of rules that we set ourselves. That's the approach that we've taken. And within those 6 elements, what we've tried to create is things that are safety to approaches that can approximate each of those 6 elements.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. What I thought I might do, I'm aware that we're managing time, and it was very helpful the way you broke that up into a coherent model that both meets a due diligence, a board language, but also taps into safety to application, Michael. So what I'm going to do, I can see a number of people here, and it's always fair game when you're hosting an event. The host always gets to ask people questions. So I thought I might ask 2 people, and they might suddenly disappear. They don't know, this is not rehearsed. And then I thought it might be really helpful. Sydney, you've been sitting there, and I can see that the cogs are spinning with golden thoughts. So what I thought we might do, as we finish up, I'm going to hand to you, Sydney, to make some closing remarks, if that's okay. And Kelvin can then say farewell on behalf of Art of Work to attending this event. But I was just wondering, Sarah Freeman, you're hiding there in the wings. Is it okay, Sarah, and you can say pass, but are there any comments or observations you might like to make? And then I'm going to go to David Shellback. So there, David, you've got a head start. But I thought, Sarah, like all of you, I can see are patiently and engaged with this conversation. Would you like to make any comments? And I've just unmuted you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Mark. And likewise, really enjoyed the discussion this afternoon. And just picking up on the comments that were just made in relation to the 6 things in the due diligence index and the need to have a consistent approach for this to work. I'm fascinated to, I guess, hear views in terms of how we do get that consistency. And I guess just linking it back to the chaos that we're seeing at the moment with regards to response to COVID-19 and how challenging it is to get consistent messaging generally, not just obviously politically across organisations, but also consistency within organisations. We in our own organisation have had a fabulous response to wanting to do the right thing, engaging with our people where we can, and we have got a phenomenal response from everybody in terms of responding, being agile and being responsive to varying and changing circumstances around us. But in doing that, we get a lot of different messaging coming through, because we all are coming at it from our own different perspectives and views, and how we maintain that consistency in our communications with our messaging. It does speak to the question that was just raised in terms of this need to have that consistent approach, not just within our own organisations, but obviously across the industry, so that there is that benchmark and we are able to talk similar languages as we go forward. I don't have the answer to that, other than we need to continually obviously have dialogue with each other and share our messages and how we get that through. But just interested to hear the challenge, whether you do have any advice in relation to that space.
What I might do, Sarah, it's a great question. Anyone want to make a comment about that consistency? And then David Shellback will be really pleased, because it buys him a little bit more time before he might make an observation. But anyone want to make a comment? I'll go first to the room. And if I see you unmute, I'll appreciate you're ready to make a comment. If you've already made a comment, that's fine to jump back in. You're not excluded from the conversation. So I'm scanning. I can't see anyone come off unmute. So I might see Kelvin, if you want to make because I know this has challenged us in several conversations with many clients around this notion of consistency. Would you like to make a comment about that? Then I'm going to go to Dave Shellback, and then I'll hand to Sydney to close out. Or if Michael, you've got a closing comment as well. So Kelvin.
Yeah, look, I won't deal in detail, but I think the having consistency comes through the framework, and in terms of again, it will vary slightly from organisation to organisation about how that framework, reflects to meet their own organisational construct. But there are some definitive types of inputs, that are key to each one of the 6 elements. And we do understand, for example, that we have some understanding about how to frame up measurement pieces around understanding the hazards and their controls and the metrics that forms in that part. We have some understanding, there's some consistency and framework around how we engage in connection between leadership and the front line and the feedback from those processes. So in terms of doing this, there's certainly been a lot of thinking done in terms of creating a framework, but allowing adaptability within organisations to actually collect metrics in a way that fits them, but allows it to be brought back into a process where it gives you the ability to compare without having exactly identical outputs. But it's a broader discussion, but part of the thinking about this actually frames from the concept around freedom within the framework to make this work on a mechanical basis.
Excellent. Thanks, Kelvin. Can I come to you, David, if it's okay? I've unmuted you. If there's any sort of observations or comments you want to make?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I will caveat this, that during this webinar I joined 10 minutes late and have taken 4 calls about coronavirus.
Well, David, you're a living testimony to what we're talking about, adaptability in the chaos.
Absolutely. But I will, I guess, just share an anecdote just to sort of close this out, and I can see Michael will start to chuckle when I talk about this one. But like we do have, like Ixom was sold last year, and we have Singaporean owners now. And in the last 2 weeks, because I guess they've got things relatively under control, they're thinking the rest of the world's fine as well. The request to provide lots and lots of injury benchmarking data, so that they can sort of, because our owners are now moving away from reportable cases to recordable cases, and are very keen to see how we injury benchmark. And at which point I sort of responded saying, well, here's our Chemistry Australia report. but apart from that, in Australia, we actually really don't care about this too much, because we're trying to move beyond this, and even regulators aren't a big fan of injury rates as an indicator of safety performance, which I think shocked my headquarters up in Singapore that I would provide such a response. And could you please provide some more information on this? But I think this goes to sort of the key point that we need to establish critical mass of not just a few of us talking about different measures. We need critical mass as an industry of an alternative to injury rates. And until we get that, then the boards will continue to refer back to injury rates and or fatalities as benchmarking criteria. So we need to get that step change of organisations providing a different way of looking at it, so that when the CEOs are talking to each other across different organisations, we're talking about something other than injuries. So I guess I'll just wrap it up at that, Mark.
Great. No, thank you, David. And again, a very useful analogy. And I think it's about having not only the critical mass, but the willing mass to move forward. So talking of willing mass, is there anyone else who'd like to make a comment before I hand to Sid to close out the session? Peter, jump in.
Thanks, Mark. One of the comments I'd like to make, it's been a really good, interesting discussion, is that we talk about this framework, due diligence framework. It's very broad and, it's very difficult to measure. I know Exxon and Chevron and a number of our customers use what they call an integrity framework, and it focuses on key measures that contribute to the outcome of good safety. And it seems to me that that's a bit of a middle ground for how we could set that framework up. It focuses on things like leadership and the way we manage our risks and the way we recruit the right people, competency, and the way we execute work. Well, I'd like to just maybe hear your thoughts about, is there a framework that we could be moving towards that's, a little more detailed than that broad directors framework that was mentioned before?
Great. Thanks, Peter. I might hand over, Michael, you want to make a brief comment before I then hand to Sid?
Thanks, Peter. I mean, I suppose really it comes down to what you're trying to achieve. If what you're trying to achieve is a better framework from where we are, then there are a number of frameworks that you can adopt, and certainly familiar with what you're referring to, and it has some strengths. What we've tried to do is to actually engage with what directors want. At the end of a conversation around the integrity framework, someone's going to turn around and say, well, do I comply with my legal obligations? The answer is, I don't know. And so the difficulty is that unless you line it back up to what they're trying to measure, then it won't get the traction that it needs. That's why we started where we started. And it happens to be a useful indicator, provided you feed in the right measures, then you can achieve both the assurance that directors want and meaningful inputs that can reflect the state of safety. That's the thinking behind it. It's a thinking that seems to have resonated with everyone we've spoken to. So I suppose some of the alternatives have been around now for some time. There's probably a reason why they haven't been adopted more broadly. And there is actually something quite powerful about starting from scratch, because no one owns it. As in, no organisation owns it. And getting one competitor to adopt the approach of another gets you stuck down quite difficult political lines in our experience.
Great, thank
Sydney,
you,
I'm
Michael.
sure you've got some thoughts.
Yeah, over to you, Sydney.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, colleagues. All right, yeah, given the time and conscious of the constraints in all of us, two areas really quickly on the discussion that we've just had that was triggered really by Ellen and her suggestion, and then back to the current crisis that we're in, and just some overarching remarks of encouragement and inspiration, I hope. The first thing, the distinction between demonstrating versus measuring is an exceedingly compelling one that, of course, has its parallels in qualitative and quantitative data, as already alluded to by Michael. Ontologically, this is a difficult argument to make with fellow scientists, because the distinction between the two doesn't seem as clear once you start going underneath. But I won't get bogged down into that now. For now, let's uphold the distinction as meaningful. And what stands out to me from the discussion is that a demonstration is fundamentally relational, whereas a measurement is putatively objective. A measurement is, and I'll use some words that Michael already used, transferable, comparable, benchmarkable, peer reviewable, whereas a demonstration is really between the demonstrator and the observer. And so there has to be a relationship between those two for that demonstration to make any sense to begin with. This is true for any ritual, right? If you watch a ritual in a Catholic church as a Protestant boy like I go, I have no idea what I'm looking at, right? And so demonstrations have or presume a prior relationship of understanding, trust, appreciation for what is about to be demonstrated. And so I think that that this, and Ellen, we have to thank you for putting that out in the open like this in terms of this distinction, goes back to some of the fundamental constraints on answering, for example, David's Singaporean bosses who want something that actually does both, that is both relational, new, innovative, and yet benchmarkable, comparable, peer reviewable, transferable, and objectively or putatively objectively available. That dilemma is juicy, rich, and complex, and the ideas that we've been talking about try to find a middle way between them, and we'll never perfectly resolve this. But enough of that, because we're in a crisis that soon may overtake these concerns with demonstrating anything to Singaporean bosses or other bosses or boards. And that is a crisis like the one that we're in actually does really interesting things, not only with organizations, but with humanity as a whole. And you must have been observing this yourself and have been drawing some conclusions about it. But if you look at the research around this, and I'll use the word that Mark used before, the duality or the dualism that you see in humanity emerge from this gives reason for pause, but also inspiration and encouragement. First of all, a crisis like this, of course, initially at least, as fear grips people, generates selfishness, and this is where we see the hoarding and the making sure that you've got your own and the rest can just go to hell. Now, however, when you compare the fear that this crisis instills in people, and you compare that to the sort of self-imposed and mostly imagined anxiety that we have used as reason to wrap ourselves during 20 years of economic progress in this country in more and more rules and protective layers of liability managing coverage, you see that all of a sudden, now that the fear for something becomes real instead of imagined, largely imagined, because, and Michael will be able to back me up in this, there are not many cases that actually show that the fear that we manage through all these regulations and rules and safety incrustations and clutter that we have do much good, nor does measuring Trifford. But now we have a real fear. And instead of wrapping ourselves in all kinds of new rules, what is helping us, and Michael was beautiful in laying this out, is allowing adaptive capacity to come forward, is allowing people the freedom to adapt and to do the right thing given their own insights. Now, this is fundamentally consistent with the research in this. What you see in times of severe crisis is actually that the model gets flipped. rather than people protecting themselves even more out of a selfish motive, what you see is that a crisis like this is a fundamental leveling device, because nobody is immune. Nobody is immune because immunity doesn't exist, and it isn't for sale. It cannot be purchased. If it could, it wouldn't be a leveling device. All right. This is so the first time that this research really comes to the fore is in the bombardments of German cities in the Second World War. And what you see emerge in those dire situations, bombardment is almost fundamentally a leveling. I mean, it's a leveling device in multiple ways, right? Even physically, but I mean psychologically as well. And so, yes, a catalyst for change. Yeah, I'll get to that, Sarah. Absolutely. But but you see generosity, and generosity with time, generosity with skills, generosity with assets, generosity with the gifts and the talents that you have received to give. And you see a new selflessness emerge. We see this already in healthcare with all the volunteers saying, I want to help, I want to help. I will come back out of retirement and actually pitch in. I'm not done with my studies yet, but yes, I'll be there to help. And what this shows is that if we unleash the trust and the confidence in our fellow human beings to do these things, we might discover once again that most people are good, that we don't have to fear our fellow human being and constrain them and put limits on their performance and monitor their behavior. Most people are good. Those are my words. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Sid. I thought I might just come to Kelvin. Then I'm going to try something that's that you'd normally do in a networking event. You thank people. And I have the capacity to do that. It's called the unmute all button. And I thought we might try something very novel. We'll clap, because I really want to acknowledge, firstly, the generosity of Sid and Michael to actually give up time to just bring a conversation to life. And for you, Kelvin, for the way you and Gideon and other people on our team have beavered to flex and change. And it would have been easy just to walk away and say, oh, this is all too hard, let's not do this. But I just want to call out your tenacity to deliver this virtual networking event. So I will do that in a moment after Kelvin's finished. I'll just hit the unmute button. If you've got earphones in, you might want to remove one of them, just in case the applause is loud, because I want to send you off with industrial deafness, Michael. So I'll come to you first, Kelvin, and then I'll unmute the button and we can just thank people. And I also want to thank you, because I appreciate, like David, your world. You've probably been managing things. There's probably been texts going on, emails happening, people trying to call you, and you go, no, I'm focused on thinking about the future and recovery. And I want to get some clues together how to drive this forward into the future. So it's also want to acknowledge you for turning up and being an active part of this conversation. So to you, Kelvin, and then I'll unmute and we can give appropriate applause to our presenters. Kelvin.
Yeah, similarly, Mark, I'd just like to thank everyone, particularly Michael and Sydney for making the time available. I think, we've had lots of conversations over the last couple of weeks as the situation's evolved. And I think for me, the essence of it is, in crisis comes opportunity. And if we think about what we've been talking about today, there's a real opportunity for us to do things differently and actually make them relevant, declutter our approach to this. And there's, particularly as professionals in this field, we've got a real opportunity to put into the practice these ideas of resilience that will not only help us deal successfully and navigate our way forward out of this situation, but probably change the way that we've been doing safety over the last 20 years. So my final thought is turning crisis into an opportunity and about enlisting in the goodwill and intent of everyone and moving towards a successful future. So thanks.
Thanks, Kelvin. So I'll unmute yep. And you might have something you have to unmute as well, but can we give a warm up round of applause for the other guys? Thank you. Great, there we go. We ain't going to be stopped by a virtual networking event. there are some rules of etiquette. So thank you very much. Very happy. We'll sort of scratch our head. We've been sort of recording this as well, so we'll somehow think with the team, Kelvin, how we can maybe extract the big ideas from today's conversation and share that back with you, but also an invitation for you to socialise those big ideas in your organisation. So again, yes, Kelvin?
The recording will go up onto our YouTube channel and we'll circulate a link to everyone on this call.
Great, thank you. So we have a technology solution. Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and stay safe, promote resilience, and look for that adaptive capacity in surprising places in your organisation. Thank you.